Today, we are diving into a political crisis that literally brought America to the edge of a second civil war. It's an incredible story about a broken election, a secret backroom deal, and the massive history-altering consequences that followed.
I mean, it's a question that feels really relevant, doesn't it? It makes you think about what happens when the gears of democracy just grind to a halt. And this wasn't just some academic thought experiment.
You see, the solution they came up with back then didn't just decide who would be the next president. No, it completely changed the country's direction and basically slammed the door on a revolutionary promise of equality.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, the incredible promise of freedom. Then, the violent backlash it caused. That leads us to the election in chaos, and finally, the deal that changed America. Let's start with that promise.
Okay, so picture this. The Civil War's over. The country is facing this monumental challenge. How do you rebuild the shattered South? And, maybe even more importantly, how do you integrate 4 million newly freed African Americans into the nation? The answer they came up with was radical.
In just 5 short, absolutely astonishing years, the U.S. Constitution was fundamentally rewritten. This trio of amendments didn't just get rid of slavery. They established birthright citizenship, promised equal protection under the law, and gave black men the right to vote. This was a whole new birth of freedom, and it was guaranteed by the highest law in the land.
This whole period is what we call Reconstruction, and it was this incredibly bold, ambitious federal experiment. We're talking about the U.S. government sending troops into the South, not just to keep the peace, but to actively protect the rights of black citizens and try to build a multiracial democracy right from the ashes of the Confederacy. But, as you can imagine, not everyone was on board with this.
Yeah, this incredible promise of progress was met with some of the most fierce and violent opposition imaginable. A backlash that was really driven by the very people who had just lost the Civil War.
For a lot of white Southerners, Reconstruction felt like a humiliating military occupation. So their political goal was pretty straightforward: take back control of their states and completely undo the social and political revolution that was happening. They even gave it a name: redemption. And believe me, they were willing to do anything to get it. Now, the most infamous tool they used was, of course, the Ku Klux Klan. And it's so important to understand that the KKK wasn't just some fringe group of extremists. For all intents and purposes, it was the terrorist arm of the Southern Democratic Party. Their goal was to use pure terror to restore the old social order.
And to really get what was at stake here, just look at this number. This is how many black Americans were lynched in the decades after Reconstruction was over. It is a horrifying preview of what the future would look like if that violent backlash succeeded and federal protection was taken away. This is the grim reality bubbling just beneath the surface.
So it's in this supercharged, violent, and deeply polarized environment that the country stumbles into the presidential election of 1876. And the result? Absolute chaos. It pushed the nation right to the brink of another war. The two main candidates really personified the country's divide. On one side, you had the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Union general, a reformer. He talked a big game about compromise, but his party was still the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction. Then you had the Democrat, Samuel Tilden, famous for fighting corruption in New York. But his path to the White House depended entirely on the support of those Southern redeemers who were fighting to kill Reconstruction.
On election night, everything looked pretty clear. Tilden won the popular vote by more than 250,000 votes. The newspapers were already calling him the next president. But, as we all know, the popular vote doesn't pick the president. The Electoral College does. And that is where everything completely fell apart.
The entire election came down to 3 southern states that were still under federal protection: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. And in those states, the results were a complete and utter mess. Both parties claimed they won. Both accused the other of massive fraud and voter intimidation, which frankly was happening all over the place. So this left 19 electoral votes totally up in the air. Tilden was just one single vote away from winning. Hayes needed every last one of those 19 votes. And with no clear rules on how to fix it, the country was paralyzed.
For months, the crisis just got worse and worse.
People were genuinely afraid that armed militias were going to march on Washington. So, to keep the country from melting down completely, leaders from both parties started meeting. In secret. The solution they cooked up wasn't decided in a court, but in a smoke-filled room.
This secret agreement is what we now call the Compromise of 1877. And you have to get this. It wasn't a law. It wasn't some formal treaty. It was a raw political bargain, a classic quid pro quo where both sides got something they desperately wanted.
And this is the core of the trade, right here. It's so simple, it's brutal. The Democrats agreed to stop challenging the election and let the Republican Hayes become president. And what did they get in return? The Republicans agreed to pull every last federal soldier out of the South. Basically, the presidency was traded for total control of the South.
And that was it. Just like that, the deal was done. Once those troops were gone, the last Republican state governments in the South immediately collapsed. The Redeemers had won. This moment is the official end of Reconstruction, and with it, the end of the federal government's entire project to protect a multiracial democracy. So into the power vacuum left by the federal government, Southern states immediately started building a brand new social order. This system of laws became known as Jim Crow, and it enforced rigid racial segregation in absolutely every part of life. We're talking schools, trains, even water fountains. And here's the most tragic part. This whole new reality was cemented into law by the Supreme Court itself. In this huge 1896 case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the court actually gave its constitutional stamp of approval to segregation, saying separate but equal was perfectly fine. That ruling would define life in the South for the next 60 years. So in the end, yeah, the Compromise of 1877 stopped a political crisis. It probably prevented another civil war, but it leaves us with one huge, lingering question. Who did it really save? It solved one problem for the politicians by creating a much longer, much deeper crisis for millions of American citizens. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.